Hello and welcome back to the e-commerce project. This is part 6. If you are completely new to the e-commerce project, that's not a problem at all. You can download and start from this section. So all the code is in the description, the video description. You can start to download it from there and then just start from this tutorial. In this tutorial, we focus on the account. So in the previous tutorial, we were looking at manipulating and changing and refactoring and normalizing, the tables for the products. So now we're going to focus on the account. So at the moment we have one table for the account, and that causes a problem. For example, if the user wants to store multiple addresses. So we're going to normalize the tables slightly to allow the user to have multiple addresses. And then we're going to address the new user interface here, or we're going to address the user interface. And you can see it looks a little bit like the Amazon interface. So when users log in, they are now presented with 3 options. They can view their orders, change their login and security details, and then also now change their address. So we're going to focus on this address section in this tutorial. The address section is going to be a CRUD system: create, return, update, and delete. So here you can see that the user can add a new address. And then once they've added a new address, it will then appear, and they can then set it to the default address they want to use as their delivery address. And we can change that as and when we want to. We can also go ahead and delete any addresses we don't need anymore and then edit them. So that's what we're going to be building here in the e-commerce part 6. So to summarize, we're going to create a simple CRUD example. We potentially will move this to class-based views in later tutorials. And then in this tutorial, I also want to introduce the universal unique identifier field, which we can now start to utilize within our application. And we'll have a look at why and how we might want to use that within our application. So this is our workflow. We're going to just review the accounts models. I'll take you through the changes that we're going to make there. And then we go ahead and create the address table and then review the dashboard UI. So I'll just take you through how or what changes we've made there, and then we go ahead and build the address CRUD system. So if you remember in the previous tutorial, we are using the dbdiagram.io to help us plan out the tables that we're using in our system. So this was a view here of the previous section that we covered and the tables that we created. Now this is all built by this code here. Now if you want to access this service, it's free. If you want the code that starts to build or shows you how to build these tables, if you just go over to the projects and go into the documentation, the underscore documentation folder, you'll find that there is a file here called database schema text, and that is the code that you can type into here on the left hand side to create all these tables. So I've reviewed the let's move this down. So I've reviewed the customer table, and we've now gone ahead and just made this change to the table. So previously we had one table for the customer, and that had, for example, the address within this table. Now the problem here is if I have the address information within the customer table, if the customer wants to have 2 addresses, for example, we need to make 2 identical records inside of the database, inside of this table, And of course, if the customer has a unique ID and we make a new row for the customer, then we've then got 2 unique IDs which represents the same customer. And obviously that breaks our table because there's no way of then knowing which customer, the same customer we want to actually utilize. So the customer would have to have 2 logins, for example. So here what we've done is we've created a new table called address. We've added all the address parameters or attributes to the address or field, in the address table, and we're creating a one-to-many. So here we're saying that inside the address we're going to have a foreign key, customer here, to the customer table, and that's going to create a one-to-many. You can see the 1 and the star representing one-to-many. So for one customer, they may have many addresses. So many addresses might be associated to one customer. So one-to-many. So you might be wondering about why I've called it customer when, for example, I am going to also have staff members here. So eventually we're probably going to need to think of a way of having a separate table for customers and a separate table for admin. Maybe that's something that we can focus on in a later tutorial, but for now we're going to call this table customer, and we're also going to have staff within this table, just in case you're wondering why that is. So go ahead and download the repository from the previous tutorial. Now you will find this on the GitHub account, or if you go over to YouTube, just access the part 5 video and you'll find the link in the description. So once you've downloaded, opened in Visual Studio Code, we can now go ahead and create a new virtual environment. So go ahead and do that and take a couple of seconds, and we just need to activate it. If you're not familiar with this, of course you can just skip this section of the tutorial if you want to. So we'll just go ahead and activate it, and now we just need to pip install the requirements. So we need the R flag requirements. Give that a go. That'll take a couple of seconds just to install all the dependencies and other packages that we need. So once that's done, we can then start the server. So py, yours might be Python, of course. So here I'm running on Windows. So py and then manage py and then run server. Okay, and there we go. As advertised, we're going to first of all just review the account model and then make the changes to create the new address table. So we are going through kind of the normalization process rather slowly, but thinking about some of the features that we're going to need at the same time. So let's have a look in the accounts and then the models. So at the moment, we have the user model. There we go. And you can see that at the moment, we had all the fields about the delivery details inside of the user base. That's the default or the new custom user table that we created. So what we're going to do is we're going to remove all these items here from the user base table because we're not going to include them there. And then we're going to place them inside of a new table. So I'm going to be making some changes here to the names or the naming scheme of the custom user table. So the custom user table is now going to be called customer. And you can see that I'm going to go for ID. That's going to be the automatic ID that Django includes when we create the table or when we migrate the table. I'm going to go for email as per normal. So the email is still going to be the login, but this time we're going to just have name. So we're going to have email, name, and then mobile. It's probably very commonplace now to store the mobile phone details about the customer to validate them for security reasons, maybe to send them messages, account information. If there's a problem with the account, or if you need to, for example, change your password, the mobile phone might also then come into that kind of process. So we'll include that in, and then the password as per normal. Now, the password we don't include. You'll notice if you're wondering where the password comes from, it actually gets included through the abstract base user. So this class here has a field, and the password field, so Django puts that in for us. And then everything else is pretty much the same. Is active, so we're going to record whether the user or the customer in this case is active, their account is active or not. And again, like I said previously, we are kind of mixing here customer with the kind of admin. So the admin is going to be stored at the moment on the customer table. So we still have is staff created at and updated at. Okay, so you can see here we're going to make a foreign key, a new table address, foreign key customer to the customer table. And you can then see we're just going to add the normal type of information you might want to include in the address table. Now, you might want to make this regional. Here, I'm just going to add a field here called country region. I'm not actually going to be utilizing it. I did show you in a previous tutorial a plugin that you could utilize countries so that you can create a massive drop down here so users can select their country. So that's something that you can add. I'm just going to try and go for a generic type of table here with the generic kind of fields that you might want to include in the address section. So let's go ahead now and make these changes to our table. So here we are in the project and account and models. You can see that the existing class or the table is called user base. So now we're going to change that to customer, of course. And then we're just going to get rid of these delivery details. That's what we're going to be utilizing in our new table. So I'm also going to get rid of about. That's not really applicable here. And then in addition to that, let's just quickly review this. So email, name, and mobile. So email, we're going to call this name, and we're also again going to have mobile. So now we've made those changes, you'll see that we need to go through and now make additional changes here. So required fields, it's going to be name. So that's going to be unique in our table. So not only are we going to have an email that's going to be unique, we're also going to have a name for that user, which is also going to be unique. Now you can make changes here because I'm literally saying there must be an email and a username. So unique username. Using the word name here suggests that, for example, if someone's name is Bob and then someone else, another customer is called Bob, then we're going to have problems. Even if they put in their full name, there's bound to be two people with the same name. So you're going to need to make a decision there. So I'm going to change my decision and then allow the name to be just a normal name field. And then the email is going to be unique in the system. Of course, they will have an ID, a unique ID for that customer too. So now we've removed, we need to now have a look through our required field. Now is going to be name. So we need to look through here, and basically we're not going to be utilizing the username anymore. So we can get rid of that. And so it's just going to be self and email that's going to be required. Now we can specify, for example, when we create a new user, we also are going to ask for the name. So because it's not a mandatory field now, you don't need to necessarily have that in, but let's just go through and make sure that we've removed all instances of username, and we're going to now just change that to name. Okay, so you can see that Visual Studio Code is helping us find those. So that should be it now. Okay, so at the end here, we've also got name, so that also needs to be removed. So you can see I'm going to keep the verbose name here and plural accounts. So in the actual admin system, it's going to be called accounts, but the actual table is going to be called customer. Right, so let's go ahead now and deal with the address table. So the address table then, we're going to start off with the class address model as per normal. I'm going to add, potentially where I can add some documentation later. And this time now I'm going to use an ID. So I'm not going to use the Django default ID anymore. I'm going to be utilizing this UUID field. So let's try and explain what this UUID field is for, why we're going to use it. So traditionally then, Django provides us, when we create this table, an ID field. It creates a nice ID field for us, an integer, or it provides a way of us creating an auto-incremented number. So every time we add something to the address table, that will increment. So we add something to the address table, and the ID is going to be number 1, a reference point for that data, so a primary key. And then we add another address to a table, that becomes number 2, and so on. Just kind of auto-increments every time we add a new item. So every item will then have this unique number within this table. So a potential problem here is that, take for this example, we create our edit page. Now in order to create this edit page, we're going to need the ID of the address that we want to edit. So if, for example, we add in an address here, that's going to have the ID of 1, for example. So if we wanted to access that address, we would then need to utilize that ID within the URL here to then pass that back to the system to make the query to actually get that data from the database. So this becomes very obvious to anyone, because if you want to get the next address, just type in the letter 2 there, or the number 2, sorry, there, and that would get us then, or try to retrieve the other address, and so on. We could just type in numbers here to see if we can get random addresses. Now obviously our system would protect us from that, because not only we would use the ID of the address, we would also use the username or the user also to collect that data. So we wouldn't necessarily, or users wouldn't necessarily be able to access any of addresses, but it does potentially make it easier for people to try and access addresses or other sensitive information, because it's really obvious that we're just using this auto-incremented ID. So we could potentially try to access things through just typing this into the browser. Now what we're going to do with the UUID here is that we're going to create a much longer string, a random kind of string here with lots of numbers. So it makes it a lot harder for someone to try and guess that unique identifier for this, for example, address. So now we have this unique identifier here. Like I said, it becomes a lot harder for someone to guess. And we then remove the normal traditional ID potentially from our table. And now we're utilizing the new UUID field, which is going to be this longer string that's going to be created to uniquely identify the address. There are a number of pros and cons here of utilizing the UID here field. And it'd be well worth reading into that, but I'm just presenting it to you based upon the fact that it does provide us a little bit of security here on the front end, in that we don't need to utilize the traditional kind of primary keys. Now, what you could also do, let's not forget, we could create a unique identifier in this way as for example, a public facing identifier, and then we could also just use the traditional ID as well. So we could call this, for example, public ID, and then just allow then Django to utilize the normal ID. So we could also run that way if we wanted to. So like I said, there are a number of pros and cons. Maybe when you start running your queries, etc., that could maybe provide some overhead, for example. So it's well worth planning out if you're seriously thinking about utilizing this. Right, let's just move on. I don't want to dwell on it too much. Please go and have a little read. If you've not utilized this before, it's well worth having a think about and implementing it within your system. So like I said, we can apply that throughout the whole system. We're not going to at this point. We're just going to move on. So we want to add the other fields now to our address table. So we have the customer field. So that's going to be our foreign key. Now remember that Django is going to place _ID here in the actual database. And this is why I've not included it here. As like the ID to denote the fact it's kind of a foreign key over to the customer table. So I'm just going to use customer foreign key, and there we go. So then we have the full name, phone number, postcode, address to, town, city, delivery instructions. So here I've included delivery instructions. We probably won't apply it here, but you can add this into your form so that users or customers can add any kind of delivery instructions that you might want to include, created and updated, and default field. So customers will potentially want to select their default address. So we've added this Boolean here to allow them to do that. So we just finish off with some meta for the table, address and addresses, and last of all, then we just return the string address. And there we go. So that's our table now sorted. So now we've made these changes, eventually we'll go ahead and create maybe some management features or management commands to manage this more effectively, but we are still doing this manually in the migrations. So I'm just going to remove all the migrations. I realize I could probably fake this, for example, but I'm just doing this manually for now. So in accounts, and then in our store, the migrations, just need to remove all the migration records and then orders. And that removes all the migrations. Now I'll go ahead and remove the table. So I am still doing this manually. Like I said, I realize this can all be done automatically. We'll get there. And then we can go ahead and now do a make migrations. Oh, I forgot to add that. So going back into the account, because we're using UUID, we're going to need to bring that in. So at the top here, we just need to add that resource, and that is going to be just import UUID. So that's going to be from the Python core library or packages. So UUID, there we go. So now we should be able to migrate. Okay, looks like we've got a problem here. Improperly. So auth user model refers to account user base. Of course it does. Okay, so if we go now into our core, and we've added a settings folder if this looks strange to you. We've got the base, that's our just the normal settings. At the bottom here, we need to change the author, the account, and then customer. That's our new table, the auth user model. So that's just the default user model for the custom user model that we've created. So we've changed the name there, and hopefully now we can then go ahead and migrate. No, we can't. Okay, where are we looking? So line 3, because we're importing it into other files, so we just need to sort this out. Account admin. So I forget about that. So that's the admin area. So import not user base, customer, and that's just for the admin. Okay, so we need to change that. And then cannot import user base, accounts model. Account models. Looks like a line. So account. So cannot import user base from account model. So that's in the account forms. Okay, user base, import customer. So we sorted out the form to allow users to log in. Now if we give this a go, we've now got some more problems on the form. So let's just account, so it was user base, wasn't it? So let's have a look. So from models, import customer. And so here we've got the model defined as incorrectly. So we just need to select from the right table. So we're just going through now and looking for where it says user base and changing it to customer. I realize I could just do a search and find here, but I just want to do this manually. Okay. So, and one last one here. So in the forms. Okay. So I think I'm done there. It'll soon tell me, of course. Okay, so line 13 in the views. So now I need to go over to the views and line 13 where I've imported it in. So this is exactly why you don't want to potentially import this in manually all the time. So we can refer to this table through the settings. You're probably wondering why I haven't done this. So of course here we are setting up the default user model here, and we've defined it here, but I'm manually calling it in the other file. So you don't need to do that, of course. You can just refer to it from the settings within these files. So if you do make these changes, then you wouldn't need to do this, of course. So there we go. So now we can create migrations. So once you've done that, let the errors guide you on where you need to make changes, but essentially you need to change the model, the forms and the view in order to get this working. So I've gone ahead and made the migrations there. So now I can migrate, and now we're back up to where we were. So I'll just go ahead and create my super user. Oh, what am I doing? Create super user, just to check to see if this is still working. So we have now the email and name, not username anymore. So that's the two mandatories that we need. So you can see here we've got an error because somewhere it still says username. So we need to go back into our models and just do a search here for username. So you can see here it says username, so that should be name. Looks like that's the only place we've got there. So now let's go ahead and try this again. Create a super user. And there we go. So we started the server. So while we're not using the Django debug toolbar, it's probably worth just turning it off. So if you remember here in the core, we created a settings, we created a dev debug, and we got the base. So the dev debug was just to kind of activate the debug toolbar. So what we need to do is if we go into the our manage py file here, and we just change this now to core and then the default, which is base. So base. Then when we start up our project server, sorry, I'll just close the server and start the project server again. We should now be running the base. Seems to be a problem here. No module name core base. Let's just go back to our unmanaged file. So core.base. So we had settings, so we needed to go into the settings file. That's why, because we have a settings folder, sorry. So let's just start that up again. Okay, so now we're running without the debug toolbar. Okay, so this is where we ended up with. Now you've seen from the preview that we want to kind of make some changes here. We want to kind of integrate the login and the accounts into a separate feature now, so that we have a drop down. And then of course we also now want to change up the dashboard so that we have, like we do for example in Amazon, some links here, some boxes which will then connect us to different areas of the system. So this is where I really want your feedback here, please. How should I best show you through the UI? When I start making these changes here, normally I kind of just drift through, giving you some basic overview of how I've done this. And I don't go through this line by line, etc. Hopefully you kind of get the idea of what's going on. In my opinion, or what I'm thinking, is that you will have a look at the base code that are provided in GitHub, and you can then just copy and paste it in. So that might not be your preference, or if you can think of a better way I can kind of present this to you that would be more valuable, then please let me know. It'd be a good idea just to get your general feedback on how you like the front end to be kind of delivered, so that I can change things to make it more palatable for you. So first up then, we're going to just change the menu here, like you saw in the preview, so we have a nice little drop down. So let's just go ahead and do that. Now we just need to remember where the drop down is, or where that bar is, and that's in the templates, and that's our base. So this base file here has, and it's a rather big file, this navigation area here, which is rather large. It's rather cumbersome to kind of show you how to make these changes, just because there's just so much code on the screen here. And again, if you're not familiar with Bootstrap, that makes it even more difficult for you. I appreciate that. So let's have a look at some of the changes that we need to make. So this is incredibly easy to get wrong here by removing the wrong element, etc. So the first thing we need to do is just get rid of the logout section. Now it's just a case of working out where that starts and ends. So there's this A tag here which is wrapping it around, and it allows me to kind of then create that link for the logout section. So I'm just going to delete that because I'm not going to need that anymore. Else it's going to show login. Well, I don't need login either, so I'm just going to remove that, but I'm going to keep this if else. So this if else statement here is for when people are authenticated. So if someone is authenticated, I show them this. If they're not authenticated, then I'm going to show them this instead. So that's what's happening there. So we keep that for now. So I've made those changes. We should have now, that is now disappeared. So we have no login or logout button. So now to the account button. So here we do the same thing again. So we find out where this button is. Looks like it's just here. I'm going to remove that button, and now we refresh and it's gone. So there's a fair bit of code here, so I'm just going to remove that. I'm going to put this between the button and where the link starts here for the basket. So I'm just going to go ahead and paste this in here. So you can see it's quite a large block, starts with a div element here. So we're going to create a collapsible, we're copy and pasting from Bootstrap the collapsible drop down menu essentially. And you can see I've got this unordered list here, and then this list. So that's kind of the drop down list. Inside of this list, I then have some different items. So I'm just kind of retrofitting here a list drop down. And you can see that inside of this list item, I'm adding more elements here. So I start off with my link for the account button. So here it's going to say hello. If the user's logged in, it's going to say their username. And if they're not logged in, it's just going to say login. So again, similar to Amazon. When you're not logged in, it just says hello login. If you are logged in, it says hello, comma, then your name. So then underneath that, it's going to say accounts or account list. And then that's about it really. So then we have this drop down. So this is the drop down element here. You can see that I've created a number of different links to different areas. So we've got links to your account, orders, log out, and log in. Now they should all exist So there's nothing new there. So let's just give this a go. We have this drop down, and there we go. So that takes us to the there, and everything else, this logout will allow us to log out and so on. So you can just copy and paste from the repository this section, and it should work absolutely fine. There should be absolutely no other changes that you need to make. So from line 64, we've just added in this new piece of code here. So that's pretty much all that's needed there. Now, secondly to this, if I were just to move this down into mobile view, you can see that disappears. Apologies, you can see that disappears. I've got the drop down here, but we're also now going to need to add to this drop down all the other user items. So let's just go ahead and do that. So what we need to do here is just find that section where it drops down, which is right at the bottom, the last component here. So it's this component here. So when we drop down, this component is shown. I think that's right. Oh, yep. Okay, so what we need to do now is just add some code in here, which is basically going to be a copy and paste, right, of the items that I've just shown you previously. So I'm going to copy and paste it right here. Let's just get this right. So it's going to be after this unordered list. That's the normal unordered list for that. So I'm going to create this new section here. You can see that I'm creating a title using a H6, my account, and then this is the list that we had above, which I've just copied in. And then let's just have a look at that, see if that works. So when we go into mobile view, so F12, now when I drop down with shop, we now have the all, as in all products, and we also now have your account, orders, etc. Okay, so that kind of completes that section then of the UI. So you can see in the dashboard, if you remember from the previous example, we had some new sections now. So we're going to get rid of this change detail and add these small sections so that users can click on the button to allow them to, or signpost them to the separate areas that they want to go to. So let's go over to the, which is going to be the account and then dashboard. And then the dashboard.html, that's the page that we're utilizing for the home page of the dashboard. Now, if you were just to copy and paste from the repository, the code repository, there's just going to be one slight problem. So all I've done is I've made the changes here. Sorry, I've copied from the repository in the GitHub repository. I've just copied the new dashboard code across here. And what you're going to receive is this error here for addresses not found, because we haven't built that yet. So let's just go ahead and just remove line 58. And then let's just save that up, go back in, refresh. And you can see that we've got this new section here. It's going to look a little bit like this. But essentially what we've done is we've created some blocks here in the middle. We've utilized some icons from Bootstrap. So if you're wondering where those are from, if you go over to Bootstrap and then just go into the icons here, I've just collected all the icons from here. So we're just using the icons from Bootstrap here. So that's the icons. But here essentially what's happened, if we move up, is we've created this column. Inside of these columns, we've got three new items here, 3 new columns, and that's pretty much it really. That's pretty much all that's happening. So you can copy and paste that in, and you'll then have or be presented with this section here like this. Now you can see that when I zoom in, at the moment it's potentially not really responding very well. We want this box to potentially scale up as we move in. So what we're going to need to do is, if you go into where the dashboard is, come out. If you remember, it's using this sub base here. So at the moment you can see that this sub base, it says, well, it's a bit of a mixture going on here. At the smaller size, or all sizes, it should be column 12, so the whole width. And so at the smaller size, that box we saw will be at the full width. And then it goes into MD6 and then large 6 and MX Auto because it's in the middle. So I think what we need to do here is just make a few changes to this. So we're going to change this over to col 12. So everything's going to be col 12. So let's just go back now into the code. So you can see now that it's completely, looks like it's completely messed up. Let's just go back into the, there we go. So now you can see it's kind of moved across to the full width. So what we need to do now in the sub base is just change container fluid to container, because we don't want it the whole width. So let's go back in now, and there we go. So now when we zoom in, you can see that it's going to be nicely formatted on the page. So those are just the small changes that we needed to make. Again, these are just small changes. I understand Bootstrap. Again, if this is where the problem occurs, if you're following this step by step and you make one little mistake, it's then hard for you to understand what's gone wrong. So please just refer to the code here. Like I kind of said, I'm never too sure how much information to give you here, because we could go on for hours about front end things here. So hopefully that was useful. So now then we've got everything hooked up. The orders isn't hooked up anymore, so that's something that we'll be missing after this tutorial, the orders. And then we now have your addresses. So now we can focus on the your addresses. Okay, so we've reviewed and created a new table, and that's pretty much all the changes that we're going to make to the dashboard and UI. So now we can go ahead and build the CRUD system. So create, return, update, and delete. So we have the table in place, the address table in place. So now we just need to build this. So we're going to make it as simple as possible. We're going to have a URL for each section. So create, return, update, and delete. So we'll go ahead and do that. And then we just add some simple views using functions approach for these different functions that we're going to need to build. So let's just start off by just removing everything here. Okay, so we're going to be in the account, and we're going to go into the URLs. So there's a little bit of a mess in here at the moment. We're going to need to tidy up this eventually, but we're going to add some more paths. So let's just think about what we're going to need here. So we're going to need to view, update, delete the addresses. So we may as well just go ahead and build everything that we need. So first of all, we're going to need like a home page for the addresses, right? So we're going to build a path for that. So this is going to be called addresses. And then we're going to need to add an address. So we have the add address path, and then we're going to need to edit. So when we edit, you can see here, we're going to pass in the ID of the actual address we want to edit into the view, so then we can then run the query against that ID and collect the right address to edit. We're then going to do the same type of thing here for delete. So we're going to need to be able to identify what we want to delete. So the view is going to bring up an address. That's going to have an ID, of course, and then we're going to pass it over to the view, which is then going to delete that address from the database. And then the last of all, set default. So this is going to be a path that's going to allow us to set a default based upon the ID of that particular address that the user is asked to select or set the default on. So here we're going to create 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 paths. Now, of course, this is just one approach, and this is obviously the most simplistic way of building this, so you can see exactly what's going on here. We could convert this potentially into maybe 2 paths if we were utilizing class-based views. And of course, we could probably just build one class and have one address. In actual fact, that could potentially work too. So hopefully over time we're great, and we'll look at more kind of exotic code that we could utilize to create a more efficient way of working. But this works. At the end of the day, this will work, and therefore it will be a valid way of working. So now we have everything in place. Let's just do this one by one. So let's just comment that out. So let's start off by building the address view. So we're going to need to go into the views, of course, for this. So we call this addresses, just to remind myself of that. So let's open up the view. So let's just build a new section then at the bottom here. So we're going to create a new section. Let's just call this address section for now, so we can just point to it later or just easily find it later on. And now the next thing we're going to need to do, of course, is we're going to be working with the address model. So let's just bring that in. So that's the address model that we're bringing in to our view, so we can start working with it. So previously, apologies again to scroll up, it's always hard to see when you scroll up. So previously then we brought into this project the login required declarator, and by declarating our function, it essentially means in this case, for example here, you can see that this view will only be accessible if the user is logged in. So we'll start off then with the login required declarator here, because the user has to be logged in to actually view their address. So first of all, we're going to create view address to allow the user to actually view the address. So this is going to be like the home page for the addresses here. So that kind of matches up here with our URL view. And now we can then go in and create a new variable, addresses. We want to capture all the addresses that are related to that user. So here we're going to need to build a filter. So we're going to be in the addresses table, objects, the object default object manager. We haven't created a separate object manager for this, and then a filter. So here what we're going to filter is where customer equals request.user. So when the user makes a request, notice that we've got a request here, we can collect the user ID from that request. So when the user is logged in, what they're going to have is a session in the background. That session data is potentially going to hold the user ID. So basically what we're doing here is we're bringing in that request information and we're collecting the user ID from it. So basically what we're doing here is we're running a filter now. We're going to collect all the addresses in the address table where the customer equals a request.user. That's the ID of the user. Now, if we were to go into the models here and go at the bottom where the addresses are, you can see I've got a table here called customer, and that will have the foreign key. That will have a number, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, whatever. And those numbers obviously correlate to the ID of the user in the customer table. And remember that the ID here doesn't exist because Django puts that on for us. So if we were to go into our table, so remember I've got the SQLite, extension here. So if I right click on the table, go to tables, explorer, and go into my table, and then just go into the user table. If I can quickly find it, it's called customers, account customer, and right click and show table. You can see that I've got one user here, and that's got the ID of 1. So that's how we're collecting. It's got the password, last login, is super, email name, etc. So that's my user table that I created earlier. But notice that Django's put the ID or the ID field automatically in there. So that just adds and just explains all of that. So now we've collected all the addresses about that user, we can then return them. So just a simple render return, and we then define the template we want to use. So we're going to need to build that in a second. And then we're going to also send across the context, which is the addresses that we've collected, into the template so we can display them to the user. So now we've got that in place, we may as well build this template. So that's going to be account dashboard addresses. So let's just drop some of this down. Let's move this across. So in our templates dashboard, inside of dashboard, we're going to need a new HTML template. And that template is going to be called addresses. So let's just bring this in. So I've gone ahead and pre-built this. So this is it. So this is going to extend the sub base as per normal. Is the title is going to be called edit addresses. And you can see we've got the H1 title, your address. So this is just building upon the existing template that we have. And all we're doing here is we're going to have a box on the left-hand side to allow the user to click on it to add a new address. So that's going to take them to the add address URL, which we're going to build up shortly. So that won't work just for now. So that's the button there that's going to allow the user to actually press and go to where they can add a new address. So these are just columns. So you can see for the second column here, we've got this for loop. So what's going to happen now is that we're going to collect the addresses that are returned from the table, from the database, and then we're going to loop them out. So for each an individual address we find, it's going to go into the address variable, say here, and then we can access all the address parameters from the address. So default, if it's default, it's going to say default. So this is the top section. and then we're going to then just output the address, full name, line. So this is just matching all the fields we have in the database here, just to output the address. And then at the bottom here, we've got 3 new areas to allow the user to edit, to allow the user to delete, and then also set the default. So I'll just remove them for now before we then go and add them back in. So that's the edit, delete, and set default. And then we just end the if statements, end the for statements, end the block. And then now we've kind of looped out all the addresses that the customer has. So now we can go back in. We should be able to go to your addresses. So we just need to hook that up again. So this button is in the dashboard. So let's go into the dashboard. Let's go and hook up that button. If we can find it, it should be in the 3rd column here. And it's going to be the link. So we're looking for the A link, which is just here. So we can add the address back in now. So the address here is going to be referenced as addresses. So in the dashboard, so let's just quickly manually add this in. So this is going to be URL, and then it's going to be account/addresses. Okay, so let's go back into here, refresh, go to addresses, and there we go. So we're now in the addresses HTML page we just created, where we can now go ahead and add a new address. Obviously, I've taken the links out here, so we can't actually add anything next, but that's the next task. So back into my URLs, let's activate the path for the adding the address here. So this is going to be a new function called add address. So here we're going to need a form. So we're probably going to need to create a form in a second. So let's just go into the views. Now, obviously, this is going to be login required also. The user isn't going to be able to do this unless they're logged in. So we're going to need to add an address. So let's start off by going into the forms. So we're in account and forms. We're going to need to build a form that accesses all of those address fields so that we can display them on the screen so that the user can type them in. So we're going to, first of all, in the forms here, let's just close everything down. So in the account forms, we're going to now include the address table so that we can access those fields. And let's now build a new form for this. So I'm going to call this form user address form. And then I just want to define some meta, so the model that I want to use, or where I want to collect all the fields from, or to have them automatically created for me. So what Django is going to do here, because I've specified the actual model I want to use, Django can automatically look at all the fields that are in that table and then generate obviously some input forms for me, some input fields, sorry, for me in a form so that users can just type it in. So I can specify here the fields that I want to use. So notice here, I'm not utilizing some of the fields that are inside of this table here. One being, for example, where users can add their preferences. So by all means, add some more fields in here if you want to and extend this, of course. And then I'm basically just going to add in some bootstrap here. So what I'm doing is I'm going to overwrite and set some field classes. So here you can see I'm selecting the field name input and I'm adding a class to it. So some HTML classes to it. So this just connects me to the bootstrap classes that I want to add for it. And I'm just basically going to do the same thing for all of these. So this is basically me formatting all the different input fields. So I just go through each one, address line 2, city, postcode. And that just allows me just to add some simple formatting. So I've done this, I could loop through this potentially and add this in, but I've just manually added all of this in. So there we go. So that's what you're looking at here. This is the class styling for each of those inputs. Okay, so that's my form created. So Django is going to provide me all of these fields inside of a form. So I now need to hook this form up. So I need to bring this form into my view. So go into the views, apologies, go to the top and then go to form. And if I now add that in, user address form, that brings the form in here. So I can now go back to the bottom and now finish off my view so the users can add data to the form or to the database. So let's go ahead and build up this view. We have the login required as per normal, and then we're going to create this function, as we know, called add address. So that's the function that we're going to build, add address. Yep. And now we can go ahead and create the return. So what we want to do here finally then is return both the template, which is going to be edit address, or edit addresses in this case, and then also the form data to the template. So that's what we want to return ultimately. So what we can do is bring in the form that we've just created called user address form. So up the top here, we're going to need to bring that in right here. So we bring that in from the forms as per normal, like we've done with the other forms in this view. And then we're also going to then go ahead and now create an if statement. So what's going to happen now is, if we just left it like this, is that we would just return the template with the form data. So what we want is the user to submit that new data, the new address. So that also goes to this view. So what we want to do now is manage that. So when the user submits an address, once they've filled in the form and submit the address, they've sent in a post request to this view. So we can capture that post request with an if statement. So if request method equals post, then we're going to take the data from the form. That's what we're doing here. We name the form and then the data within it, and we put it into this address form variable. And then basically we're just going to check to make sure that data is valid. So we use the is form. So the address form, that's the data, is underscore valid. That's going to run the data against the database essentially and check to make sure that the data types are the correct in order for the data to actually be entered into the database. And then we go ahead and start preparing the data to be saved. And then of course, this data doesn't include the customer field. Now remember, this is a field that's inside of our model. If we go, so down here we have in the address, the customer. So we've added some data, some of these from these fields here, but obviously in order for us to actually submit the address, we need to match it against the customer. So we're going to need the customer ID here, which matches the foreign key customer table. So that just matches up the users in both tables. So we need to add that manually. So we take that from the request. Now a request is made by a user, whether it's user 1, user 2, etc. So that data can be passed across and we can collect that as user. So that will be, in this case, we've only got one user, so that will be user number 1. And then we can go ahead and save that information. So we're just preparing the information to be saved. We're adding more information to the address form, and then we're just saving that data out. So we then return a HTTP response redirect. We redirect them to the address homepage. So we're going to bring in HTTP response redirect. So up the top here, we brought that in, the redirect, and we're also using reverse. So we've also brought that resource in too. Right, so those are all the resources that we're going to need for that. And yeah, that's ends up with an else. So basically, if they've submitted the form, that's going to run. If they haven't submitted the form, it's just going to show them the form so that they can fill it in and submit it. Right, so let's go ahead and have a look at the edit addresses.html. So in our templates, let's go down to here, edit addresses. So I've already added this in. So this is edit addresses.html. So you can see here it's just going to be extending from the sub base, and we've got the title, and I'm going to heading here for that. So we're just using the same setup as we've done previously, utilizing the column 6 MX Auto, so it center aligns inside of the sub content block. And you can see this is going to be a form. So we set out the form, and you can now see that we're just running to check for errors. We're going to need our CSRF token. And then from then on, we're just naming from the form. You remember, this is the form. So we're sending across the data as form. So the data about the form is sent off. We can reference it via form here. So you can see inside of here, we can reference form, phone, address, town, city, postcode, and so on. So we add the labels like we've done before, and the input fields, and they've got a button at the end here which is styled, and that's pretty much it. So what will happen now is that a user would submit, it would take them to the address page. And the thing is here is that they could also press back in the browser, for example, and that would then take them back to the page and show them the form with the data inside of it. So that's not something that I want to happen. So what I've done here is I've created a little bit of JavaScript here, which basically detects whether the form is submitted. So when we, sorry, it doesn't detect that. So on click, it runs the function submit form. So what happens is that we submit the form, but what we also do is reset the form. So that, for example, if we were to go back, press back after we've submitted, then all the data would be gone from the form. So it would actually be reset. So it's just kind of a reset for the form. So with that in place, we now need to go back to the addresses and then just go into here and just add in line 13. We just need to add the link back to the add addresses. And let's go back into our code. We're just going to refresh, and you can now see we've already added some here, but we should now be able to add some addresses to our form and press add address. It says error, please try again, which was a little bit strange. I wasn't expecting that. So I missed one of the fields, and there we go. So we now have our new address added. So I can go ahead now and or do nothing else. But what we now need to do is now complete the edit, delete, and set default. So we can definitely add. Let's just try one more time. All the fields are required. There we go. And yep. So now let's go ahead and set up the other options. Right, so back in the URLs, let's activate the new edit here. So you can see with this edit that we're taking in the ID of the actual address. So it's going to take us to edit / and then you're going to see the ID of the address. And of course, we're using the UUID field, so it's going to be quite a long string there. So we're going to create a new view called edit addresses. So let's go into our views and do that. Okay, so this is going to be the same type of setup as before, as the add address. So we're going to need login required as per normal, and this is going to be called edit address. But now this time we're taking in the ID as well. So this is a separate parameter here. So remember, we're taking in the ID here. That's the name of the parameter. So that's the type of data. That's the name or the parameter, or the, I guess we could call that the variable name. So we need to take that into our view, ID here, comma ID. And now that data is saved. So that's the data that's actually in the URL, whether it be 1 or 2 or 3, etc. So we pass this in. Now, eventually what we're going to do is we're going to render this out to a new template called editaddresses.html. There's going to be a form on there, and we're going to pass the data in as address form. So this edit address function is for a new template whereby we can view an existing address and make an edit onto it. So if we, for example, don't submit any data, then we want to obviously show the form with the data inside of it. So what we're going to do is get the address. So address equals address.objects get, and then we're going to get where the primary key equals the ID. That's the primary key of the address. Now, also, in addition to the actual ID, the UID in this case, that we're passing in, we also want to match the customer. Because if we just use this here, it would mean that anyone could potentially just type in a random string and get one of the addresses. So we're protecting the user's address by matching the primary key and also the fact that it must be a customer that's actually made the request. So request.user. So that way we're kind of protecting the user from accessing and ensuring that the user can only access their data. So once we've done that, you can see we've got address form equals address, user address form. That's the actual form. And then what we do is we say instance equals address. So here what we're doing essentially is we're getting the form, we're injecting that data, this instance, into that form, so that what gets displayed on the form is the address that got returned, or the data about the address that's got returned from the database. That's what we're doing here. So that would get then passed out into the template, and then as per normal, we're going to use the same template as before. So the user address form, that's what we set up previously. So we don't need to make a new form here for this. So what we want to do now is allow the user to submit the update. So again, what we're going to do is just create our if request method equals post again. So let's go ahead and do that. So if request method equals post, let's get the data from the database, and then also let's get the data, the instance equals address, data equals request post. So this is basically just collecting the data that's been returned or been edited. And now we're going to check whether the data is valid. So we check whether the data is valid or not. And now what we have is we know essentially here, we know now what entry we want to edit. We now know what address we want to edit because we collected the data from the database. We've then got that instance, got the new data, and now we want to apply that new data. So we do address form.save, and that would then apply the new data to the address. So where before we actually selected, we just basically selected the data and we returned it. Now we're kind of selecting the data, returning it, and then saving the new data. So we then return the HTTP response as like before to the account addresses, the home page of the addresses. And then we run the else, because if we're not saving data, then we just want to display the data. And there we go. So that's pretty much a rundown of what that is doing. So we'll just save that. And now we need to create a new file called edit-addresses.html. And it's going to be a very similar setup to this one. And in actual fact, you can already see that we don't need to make any template at all because we've already created that template. So we're going to use the template that we use for the add address. So there's nothing we need to do there in actual fact. So let's go into the addresses now, and we just need to find edit because we want to now add this new URL, right? So that we can link to the edit page. So let's just bring that in. So that's going to be account, and then I think it was edit address, if my memory serves me right. So let's go back into the URLs. Edit address, that's the name. So let's just give that a go. Just refresh, select edit, and there we go. So I'm editing this. Let's just update this. And there we go, we've made an update. So that looks like it's working okay. And notice it says edit, and then we see the UUID here instead of the number 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. So you can see where that is being brought in, and obviously that's then being captured by this slug ID element here. That's then being passed over to our view. It has ID, and obviously we're using that to actually run against the database to find the data. Right, okay, so with that done, let's go back. So now we need to, for example, delete. So this is pretty simple. So let's go back into our URLs. Let's run and create this delete view. So this is called delete addresses. So super simple here. Login required as per normal. So the user needs to be logged in. Delete address, we're going to take in the ID. Remember that's the address ID, so we can run against the database to delete it. So we know which address we're going to delete. And then we're just going to run this filter here. So address equals, in fact, we don't need this variable. We could just run address, but address equals address.object.filter. And then we're going to select the address via the ID and also match the customer user ID. And then we're just going to extend that with a delete. So that would delete it nicely. And then we're just going to return a redirect to the addresses page. Okay, so that's pretty much it for the delete. So with that in place, we should now be able to delete. There we go. So we don't have Ajax here, so we are refreshing the page every time we click on delete. So that's delete. So that leaves us then with setting the default. So we want to allow the user to set a default address so that it just automatically appears when they go to purchase something. So again, this is just going to be called set default, and we're going to take in the slug ID so we can identify what the user wants to set as the default. So this is called set default. So let's go back into our views and just build this out. So no surprises, we're going to start off with the login required, and then we're going to call this set default. So take in the ID of the address so we can identify which we want to set as default. So here we're going to run this query first. So address.objects.filter, customer equals request user, default equals true. So what we're going to do here is we're running a filter in the address table. We're looking for where the customer equals the customer ID and where the default equals true. Right, so the customer is only going to have addresses in that table that's belonging to them. That's going to be uniquely identified by their user ID. So once we've collected all of those, say they had 4 addresses, we're then going to filter further where the default equals true. Now remember, in our model, we've got the default. By default, it's false. So when we add a new address, it's off by default. So what we want to do is we want to look for where in the table the address equals true. That's the one that's currently active as the default. And then what we want to do is we want to just change it. So we're just going to run update default equals false. So we're going to find the address that has the default equals true, and then we're going to false it out. So once we've done that, we now have no addresses that are set to default equals true. So all we need to do now is take in the ID of the address that the users clicked on to be the default address, and then also match it against the user ID, and then run an update, and then default equals true. And that's going to change that particular address to default equals true in the database, therefore now becoming the default address. So we're just switching over in the table the default. So let's go back now and we return them or redirect them to the addresses. So let's go back now. I think there's nothing else that we need to do there. Yeah, let's go back now into our address and then just refresh. So let's set this to default. There we go. Now we've already set in our template this option here. So let's just double check that in addresses here at the top. We've created an if statement, if I remember. Yeah, so if the address.default, now this is basically returning true. So if we're checking, here we're just running if address equals default. So if it returns true, we're going to say default there. If it doesn't return true, you can see we're running this space here. The reason why I'm running this here is just a small hack to ensure that we actually have something in the box so it scales properly. So for example, if I take this off and go back, you can see that, to refresh. So this box here potentially was scaled down to a smaller size. So the whole point of that was to ensure that the box, the top box here, stays at the same size as all the others. So that was it, really. That's going to be the set default. So now we pretty much have everything that we set out to make. So you may have already come into this problem, and I do apologize for not addressing this earlier. Utilizing different code bases here and different versions running, I got a little bit mixed up. So let's just finish this up by just defining what we need to complete in the URLs. Now the URLs aren't quite complete. Now when we go across to different URLs, we're also going to need to specify, particularly for example, the edit here and the delete and the set default. This is in the addresses template. We're going to need to, in addition to the actual URL, we're also going to need to pass in the actual address ID. So that's going to be needed and required here. The account, set default, delete and edit address we're going to need to pass in the address ID across. So let's just change that. So once you've got that, it does look like this is the actual version of code that we're finishing up with. So set default, that's working. So let's go ahead and just add a new address. So that is working okay. We can also delete them. So let's just make sure that we can finally just set the default. And there we go. So everything looks like it's working okay now. So let's go back into the accounts. And yeah, there we go. So to change this here, change your details. So this is a profile edit. So let's just go into that, edit details. Now this is just about changing some of these elements here. So we want this to be wrapped around so that we can just scale this down. We just want to wrap this around in a div here, column 6, and then center align it, and that will just then bring it down to the same size as the address section. As the other sections that we're going to create, the address section here. So we're just addressing that size there, so nothing else has changed there. So I think we're just about done here. We can now move on to the next section. So of course the next section will be the next tutorial. So there we go. That's a simple overview there of really just a simple CRUD system, implementing that into the address table so that the users can add multiple addresses for their account. So I hope there was some value there in this tutorial. Of course, we're just chunking these components into smaller components, so the tutorials aren't as long. So there's lots more to do on this, of course, and I value your input if you want to suggest different ways and approaches for me to actually display the information or present the information to you. So I will take any feedback that you have. And yeah, hopefully I'll see you in the next tutorial.